out of the EU. In a 2016 referendum at the time, Theresa May supported Britain staying in the EU. CNN's Nina Dos Santos is just outside Parliament buildings in London right now. Nina, Boris Jonson, the high-profile foreign minister, David Davis, the top Brexit negotiator, they have both now departed. Could Theresa May, this is a question a lot of folks are asking, survive as Prime Minister at this point?
Well, you can probably see the winds of change may well be blowing here in Westminster, Wolf, because that is the real concern this evening. This is, make no mistake, the most severe political crisis that Theresa May has faced since calling an ill-fated election a year or so ago, which, despite the polls showing she was going to get a majority, she failed to manage to secure. And a lot of people have said since then, also given her softer stance on Brexit than some hardened Eurosceptics would like to see, her card had been marked. Now, whether or not she stays in the job, Wolf, depends on a few things. One, whether other government ministers decide to resign from high-profile posts over the next 24 hours. Two, whether Boris Johnson, who's been quite quiet since resigning 4 or 5 hours ago, decides to openly challenge her for the leadership. In order for a challenge to take place, you have to have about 15% of the Conservative Party's sitting MPs writing to a particular committee to say that they want a new change at the helm of the party. So far, there's no indication that we've seen that. But essentially, all of this was set in motion after it was feared by David Davis, the key Brexit secretary, that he could not put forward credibly the plan that she had managed to secure over the course of the last week to the EU. He was saying she was too soft on Brexit, and she's also been goaded by the other side of the House of Commons, by Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition. Take a listen.
Cabinet agreed a comprehensive and ambitious proposal that provides a responsible and credible basis for progressing negotiations with the EU towards a new relationship after we leave on the 29th of March next year. It is a proposal that will take back control of our borders, our money and our laws.
We have a crisis in government. 2 Secretaries of State have resigned, and still we are no clearer on what future relationship with our nearest neighbours and biggest partners will look like.
Well, all of this is extremely significant, the timing of this, Wolf, because obviously the US President Donald Trump is about to visit the UK later on this week, and he's also set to go to NATO as well. This at a time when the UK is at the centre of a big political and security crisis, with, of course, news overnight that one of the 2 victims of the latest Novichok poisoning actually sadly lost her life. So there's a murder investigation underway. The Foreign Secretary post is open. The post of the position of the person who's negotiating with the EU is filled temporarily, but whether or not the Prime Minister will stay is the next big question that we have to answer here.
Yeah, we'll watch it very, very closely, including the meeting with President Trump this week. Thanks so much, Nina Dos Santos, joining us from London. Let's get some analysis from our CNN Global Affairs analyst, Max Boot, who's joining us right now. Max, this comes, just a few days before the Prime Minister's meeting with the President of the United States. What do you make of these late-breaking developments?
Well, Wolf, to me, this is a sign of how Western politics is increasingly being polarized in country after country. You're seeing, on the one hand, the loony left represented by Jeremy Corbyn. On the other hand, you have the rabid right represented by Boris Johnson and the hardcore Brexiteers. And what Theresa May is trying to navigate a centrist course between them, trying to negotiate a soft Brexit that will not cut off all the trade advantages that Britain enjoys in trade with the EU. And of course, that's not good enough for the hardcore ultra-nationalist faction in the Tory party. So this is a very difficult situation, and I fear it'll only be exacerbated by Donald Trump's entrance into the scene, because of course he's been very sympathetic to the pro-Brexit forces.
Yeah, he certainly has. Let's talk about the NATO summit this week in Brussels. President Trump is going to that summit, now complaining once again very openly, very bitterly about defense spending or lack thereof from his perspective by many of the NATO allies. What's the fear here? Could the president be permanently weakening NATO as an alliance and potentially further emboldening Russia?
That is the fear, and he is definitely weakening the alliance. The question is whether it will survive his presidency or not, and part of that will depend, I think, on how long he stays in office. But it is really striking the degree of hostility that Donald Trump evinces against NATO. Have you ever heard him say anything positive about NATO? I mean, maybe some boilerplate and some scripted speeches, but off the cuff in rallies and in his tweets, it's all criticism, 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 and not just of NATO, but also of the EU, the 2 great institutions that have created the post-war European order founded upon peace and prosperity, Donald Trump is really calling all that into question with his hostility towards our allies and our alliances, and at the same time his sympathy for Vladimir Putin, who is also trying to destroy NATO and the EU, and there seems to be a convergence of interests here between Trump and Putin, which is very dismaying and disturbing.
But Trump has been saying these things about the NATO allies, not since taking office, not since the campaign, but for so many years earlier. I interviewed him on many occasions over the last many years. He was always railing against the lack of defense spending by key NATO allies, so this is nothing new.
It's nothing new, but what that shows is that this is truly a deeply held belief of his, and he will not be swayed from it. Remember that last year, it took everything that H.R. McMaster, who was then the National Security Advisor, could do to get Trump on his previous trip to the previous NATO summit to simply avow that he would support NATO Article 5, the mutual defense provision. But now H.R. McMaster is gone, and there's kind of a sense that the axis of adults has lost power in the White House. They can't restrain Trump anymore. He's kind of feeling his full Trumpiness, as it were. And so he is acting on his most deeply held beliefs, which, as you mentioned, include this innate hostility towards America's allies and trade partners, which goes all the way back to the 1980s.
Yeah, he always, for many, many years, has raised serious questions. Why does the United States need troops in Germany, need troops in Japan, need troops in South Korea?
Right.
That's another issue we can discuss down the road. Let's talk about North Korea very quickly while I still have you, Max. As you know, wrapping up some high-level talks, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in North Korea over the weekend. He left, issued this statement: the U.S. is fatally mistaken. This is the North Korean statement, I should say. The U.S. is fatally mistaken if it went to the extent of regarding that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea would be compelled to accept out of its patience the demands reflecting its gangster-like mindset. That was the statement from the North Koreans about the talks with Pompeo. The president tweeted this in contrast, quote, "I have confidence that Kim Jong-un will honor the contract we signed, and even more importantly, our handshake. We agreed to the denuclearization of North Korea. China, on the other hand, may be exerting negative pressure on a deal because of our posture on Chinese trade. Hope not." So what's your analysis?
Well, I'm just amazed by Donald Trump's credulity. He thinks he has a contract with Kim Jong-un and that Kim Jong-un will honor it. By the way, this is the same president who has been repeatedly sued by his own contractors for not honoring his contracts. But there was no contract, and there was no real agreement in Singapore beyond these vague assurances from North Korea that they would work towards complete denuclearization at some unspecified point in the future. They've never delivered any specifics. They've never shown any evidence that they actually are going to give up their nuclear weapons. And the only question to my mind now is, how long is Donald Trump going to keep this charade going? How long is he going to keep pretending that there was a serious agreement and that it actually amounts to something? I suspect he will try to keep it alive at least through the election so he can claim that he reached this great deal. But it was obvious from day one to every objective observer that there was no deal, that Donald Trump was being taken to the cleaners. And, you know, the big question I have now is, how will Trump react when he's been duped, or rather when he's really duped himself into thinking that he had solved the North Korea problem, as he said right after the summit?
I think he's referring to the joint agreement that Kim Jong-un and the president signed in Singapore at the end of their talks. They both signed it. It was a document that they signed. The president is now calling it a contract. And you say that's ridiculous to call that joint agreement a contract?
Well, there's no specifics in it. A, it's not legally binding, and B, even if it were, it doesn't mean anything because, you know, Trump, the agreement talks about how North Korea wants better peaceful relations and it will work towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Well, you know, you can work towards something and never actually get there, and this is exactly the kind of language that North Korea has been using since the 1990s. It is not a specific commitment. I mean, it's ironic that Donald Trump criticized the Iran nuclear deal as being the worst deal ever, but in fact that included vastly more specific commitments, which Iran has by and large honored and given up 98% of its fissile material. There was no such commitment from North Korea. They haven't even given a full accounting of their nuclear weapons program. So, you know, Donald Trump pretending this is a contract just shows he fundamentally does not understand how the world of international diplomacy works.
And I was very much, I noticed the fact that it was very significant, I think, that Kim Jong-un did not receive Secretary of State Pompeo when he was in Pyongyang over the weekend. I thought that was significant in and of itself.
That was the first time on Pompeo's 3 visits to Pyongyang that he was not received by Kim Jong-un. And the two previous occasions were before the summit, where, you know, the strong sense that I get is that Kim Jong-un has basically gotten what he wants out of the summit without having to give anything up, because he's gotten de facto relaxation of sanctions. He has gotten legitimacy on the world stage. Donald Trump has recognized them as an equal of the American president. So he no longer feels the need to make any real concessions, because that's what he wanted. And so now he kind of gives Pompeo the back of his hand, doesn't even agree to see him, and then has his government issue this statement blasting the U.S. for gangster-like behavior.
Yeah. All right, Max Boot, thanks very much for your analysis. Up next, the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell chased out of a restaurant by protesters. What they said. And we're just hours away now from learning President Trump's U.S. Supreme Court pick, why just one dissenting Republican senator could keep, potentially, the president's choice from taking the bench.
Eastern Time this evening, and no matter who is named, conservatives will finally get the clear edge that has eluded them for decades. A 5-4 majority.